If you haven't already, please check out part 1 of this video series. What is the best scene in Solo: A Star Wars Story? This one was actually quite tough for me to figure out, and it's not because I don't like the movie. I do quite enjoy Solo. It's just not really a movie that has individual scenes that stand out to me. Like all the other movies besides The Phantom Menace have a clear-cut favorite scene of mine, but this one was tough to determine. The scenes that I have chosen so far in this series have all been around 1 minute long, but this video is going to change that. So my favorite scene in this movie is gonna be when Han and Chewbacca take a shower together. I'm sorry, I'm just messing with you. I do love that scene though. Scene may not be the right word for this video, more like sequence, but my favorite scene in this movie is gonna be the entire opening on Corellia. Is this a cop-out? Maybe, but I really do love pretty much this entire opening sequence, minus one thing which I'll get into later. For me, going into this movie, there were two very important things this story had to get right. The first was that we get a strong understanding of where Han grew up, and the second was that the movie understands the essence of who Han Solo is. And for the most part, this movie, and especially this opening scene, does a great job at that for me. The opening few seconds do a fantastic job of telling us all we need to know about Han at this point, and with very little dialogue. So let's analyze what we learn in the first 20 seconds. The movie begins with him hot wiring a speeder, which implies he is stealing it. When the camera pans up, we see he is all dirty and beaten up. He's being chased by some people in the background, which further proves he's not only stealing the speeder, but he's probably poor too. We get some establishing shots of where he lives, in that it is a pretty much rundown and poor city. Also, we see it's a construction area, which usually aren't the nicest areas either. So just like that, we learn that he's poor and that he needs to steal things to get by. When he gets back to whatever this is, we clearly can see how poor he is, and most importantly, that he loves a girl. One aspect of this scene that I really enjoy is that Han is part of a gang, it seems. Now, I want to make it clear that I'm no expert on gangs or living in extremely impoverished areas, but one thing I do know based on my years of learning is that once you are in a gang, it is very challenging to get out of it. Seeing Han and Kira steal a valuable asset from what I assume is another gang, and then lying about it to try and leave the planet seems rather realistic for me. When we finally meet Lady Proxima, she is definitely weird as hell. I'm not sure if I like her design, but either way it doesn't bother me too much. The following chase scene is rather entertaining, and I like the tension of the moment where Han and Kira are going through security. The second point about this movie that was essential for me was that it understands the core of Han Solo, and I feel this opening sequence does a good job at that. I've seen people critique the ending of this movie, but it's a critique I disagree with. Han is selfish at times, and he's a cocky asshole, but Han at his core is a good person. When he helps Enfys Nest and her crew at the end, it's not him going on his arc too soon. It's something that is natural for someone with a good heart to do. He's not committing himself to a larger cause, he's just helping someone out. In the opening, I get the vibe that he's a good person. Also, the mannerisms that we get of Han work for me. Like when he took out that rock and pretended it was a thermal detonator, that was something that Han would totally do. After Kira gets taken away and Han enlists in the Empire, I actually totally believe that is something that this version of Han would do. Han at this point is a young man, and I've seen plenty of young men sacrifice a lot and make rather poor choices just to be with a girl. So seeing Han enlist in a military just so he can get back to his girlfriend was not something I personally can relate with, but it's something I can empathize with, especially as a young man. It's a small detail, but I do love the Imperial March playing as an actual Imperial recruitment song. If I had to choose one singular aspect of this sequence on Corellia that I love the most, it would be the world building. In only about 15 minutes, we get a great sense of what this world is. We understand how impoverished it is, and we see what the gangs are like that probably run a good portion of this city. I loved seeing all the different aliens that work for this gang and how they repeatedly were chasing Han throughout the whole sequence. I'm a huge fan of good world building, so it makes sense to me why I love this sequence so much. Now, But easily the worst part of this opening sequence is the way that Han gets his last name Solo. It feels 100% contrived, and I totally see why this bothers so many people. It also just feels unnecessary. Nothing in the rest of the movie results from him adopting the name Solo. Take this out of the movie and just have his name be Solo from the beginning, nothing changes. Even the dialogue seems off. Like when the officer asks who are his people, like who says that? People say what is your last name or family name. So yeah, Han getting the last name Solo like this just doesn't work. But again, overall this opening sequence does a great job, and that is why it is my favorite scene in Solo: A Star Wars Story. What is the best scene in The Rise of Skywalker? This may be somewhat derivative of my Force Awakens best scene video, but the best scene in this movie is easily Ben Solo's redemption and his conversation with his father. To provide some context as to what happened, just before Kylo was about to strike Rey down in their lightsaber duel a moment before, Leia reaches out to Ben. I can't believe it, but there are still people out there who have misinterpreted this moment. The reason Leia reached out to Ben was not to distract him so Rey can win the fight. She reached out to him because she knew that if he killed Rey, he would be lost to the dark side forever. And in that moment, she wanted to stop Ben and let him know she still loves him. But Goldman, all she does is say, Ben, how do you know what her intentions are? Because I don't need things spelled out for me to understand what's going on. Leia still loves her son. Why else would she try to reach out to him? Anyway, Kylo stops and Rey stabs him. Rey notices that Kylo is hurt by Leia's death, so she heals him. Rey healing Kylo is so crucial to his redemption. This was the same thing that Luke did to Vader, basically. It didn't matter what Vader or Palpatine could do. Luke would continue to show unconditional compassion for his father. Rey, even at her lowest, would still show compassion towards Kylo. I like how in The Last Jedi, she calls Kylo a murderous snake. Then in the beginning of this movie, she heals a murderous snake, then heals Kylo. It's a bit of unintentional foreshadowing. Rey leaves and Kylo is forced to ponder his life choices. And then Han shows up. I believe one of the worst criticisms of this movie is that Kylo just forgave himself. Sure, I mean, technically he did. But what happened is so much more powerful than that. Kylo here is essentially putting himself through a common therapeutic exercise. It is very common for people who left things unsaid with a person who is now dead to find a lack of closure. For example, say there's a situation where, I don't know, I got mad at my mom and decided to yell at her and call her names, and I told her I hated her. If she happened to accidentally die out of the blue just after that, and that was my last conversation with her, then there's a good chance I would be deeply emotionally damaged by the fact that I never got to apologize, and that my last conversation with her was one so hostile. A common therapeutic exercise in this hypothetical would be that I get to say my final thoughts to someone else, or pretend I'm saying it to her. In the case of Kylo Ren, he deeply regretted killing his father. He tried to hide it, but everyone close to him, especially Rey and Snoke, could tell that the deed split his spirit to the bone, as Snoke said. So whether or not the appearance of Han is some sort of ghost, some sort of force projection from Leia, or simply his own imagination, he is going through this therapeutic exercise. In it, Kylo gets to relive the final moment with his father, and this time he makes the right decision. It's a close one, but this scene is probably one of the most well-acted scenes in the franchise. Adam Driver gives his best performance of the trilogy, and in very few words shows how conflicted he is. I believe an actor can show how skilled they are when they are able to convey so much emotion through only one word of dialogue. In The Last Jedi, when Kylo says please to Rey about her joining him, you can tell his plea is genuine. In this scene, the way he says dad is so powerful. All the emotions of Kylo Ren are let out at once, and after 3 movies, he finally becomes Ben Solo again. He couldn't get rid of the love he has for his family, proving once again that love will always beat hate. This scene is just textbook George Lucas Star Wars, and it's easily the best scene in the movie. As important as the scene is for Ben, it's just as important for Han too. This one scene single-handedly justifies his entire existence and arc in the sequel trilogy, mostly The Force Awakens. As I stated in my Force Awakens best scene video, the sequel trilogy didn't bring Han, Luke, and Leia back to simply sell tickets. The storytellers decided decided to give those 3 heroes arcs to go on. In A New Hope, Han was a selfish man, and while he does go on the arc of fighting for a cause and for his friends, The Force Awakens solidified his arc that he would be willing to die for someone else. Han probably knew there was a very good chance Kylo would kill him, but even if there was a small chance his son would return to the light, he had to take it. Han dies confronting his son, but he does not die in vain. Many argue that Kylo Ren should not have turned back to the light side, and that he should have died evil. Had this happened, it would send 2 messages that would go against everything that Star Wars is about. Firstly, it would ignore the theme of redemption, which is crucial to Star Wars, but arguably more importantly, Han would have died for nothing. Had Kylo died evil, then Han didn't accomplish his goal and died for the sole purpose of narrative tension. But because Ben Solo returned to the light side, and did so because Han spoke to him in The Force Awakens, it means that Han didn't die for nothing. Because had Han never walked onto that bridge, Kylo would have never realized how much he loved his father and thus never turned back to the light. So even though this scene is only in the 2nd act of the movie, it's pretty much the culmination of 2 character arcs, and the themes of the arcs are perfectly in line with the values of Star Wars: unconditional love, the strength and importance of family, and the possibility of redemption. And for those reasons, the redemption of Ben Solo and his conversation with his father is the best scene in The Rise of Skywalker. What is the best scene in The Mandalorian Season 1? This is a tough one, but the best scene in the first season is in Chapter 3, and it's when Mando changes his mind about giving away Grogu. To be honest, I kinda wanted to include half the episode because numerous scenes are what makes this episode so powerful, but if I had to choose one single moment, it would be when he changes his mind on the Razor Crest. Let's provide some context about why this scene is so great. Mando only cares about his job at the beginning of the season. How do we know this? Well, he doesn't simply say, "All I care about is my job and nothing else." We see how emotionally distant he is from everyone in the first half of Chapter 1. He's not interested in making friends or helping other people. All he cares about is collecting bounties and helping other Mandalorians. When Grief Karga tells him that he should take a break, all he says is that he wants his next job. His mannerisms in this first chapter perfectly illustrate his personality at the beginning of this arc, the arc of finding a purpose. Once he encounters Baby Yoda, he doesn't instantly change who he is. He still has the intention of bringing Grogu back to the Empire so he can collect his reward and get some Beskar. Character change takes time, and if it is rushed, then the story won't be compelling. His flashbacks shown in Chapter 1 also help establish this arc, because we better understand why he relates to Grogu so much. Because, like Grogu, he was once a child alone in the world. Mando once sat in a metal container saved by a Mandalorian, and now Grogu sits in a metal container waiting to be saved by a Mandalorian. Chapter 2 is all about building that connection between Mando and Baby Yoda. Many called Chapter 2 filler, but that is completely incorrect. Without Chapter 2, Mando's change of heart in Chapter 3 doesn't work. When Baby Yoda saves Mando from the Mudhorn, it further builds Mando's care for him, which is all in service of what I think is the most important scene in the entire series, which is also the best scene in this season. Chapter 3 is a masterclass in directing and storytelling. The whole point of this chapter is that Mando gives the child back to the Empire, he feels immense guilt and regret, and then goes back to save him. If we don't believe that this character feels guilty for his actions, then the whole season falls apart. It should also be noted that Mando wears a helmet the entire time. Acting is like 90% about what you do with your face, and most of it has to do with what you do with your eyes. Mando doesn't have a face or eyes that we can see, so all of his acting is through body language. I can't really credit Pedro Pascal here because he wasn't under the suit the entire time, so most of the credit here goes to Deborah Chow, the director. Just through body language, we know exactly what Mando is thinking. When Baby Yoda gets carried off, we can tell that Mando feels that guilt for what he is doing. But the most important scene in the season is when Mando is about to leave. This scene is a masterclass in directing. Based on the ball Baby Yoda was playing with earlier, we know exactly what Mando is thinking when he is putting it back on the lever. The way he just stares at it, and the speed at which he turns the ship on and back off again tells the audience Mando regrets what he is doing, and then he goes back for the child. There are so many subtle things in the beginning of Chapter 3 that sell Mando on being conflicted. It kind of reminds me of Darth Vader in Return of the Jedi. Initially, you can just tell that this Vader isn't the same Vader that we saw in The Empire Strikes Back. And throughout the movie, you really start to realize how conflicted he is, until he makes the right decision and saves Luke. We get the same feeling here with Mando. All these little moments throughout the first 3 chapters do a fantastic job at helping Mando go through this arc. He begins the series as a loner who doesn't care for much. He meets a child that reminds him a lot of his own past. He becomes very close and begins to care for the child. He gives the child away and realizes what he did was wrong and sacrifices his entire job and potentially his life to save the child he just met. This is not simply great storytelling, but it also ties into what Star Wars is all about. Mando was a loner until he met someone he cared about. Grogu becomes part of Mando's clan, which is synonymous with family. Star Wars is all about the importance of family and how it can change people for the better, and both seasons of The Mandalorian exemplify that. But all the reasons I just spoke about are why Mando changing his mind and going to save Grogu is the best scene in The Mandalorian Season 1. What is the best scene in The Mandalorian Season 2? It was very close between 2 scenes, one being the final goodbye between Mando and Grogu in the finale, but I decided to go with Mando and Mayfeld in the Imperial base in Chapter 15. I've stated before that I think this is the best episode of The Mandalorian so far. This scene technically accomplishes the same goal as The Mandalorian Season 2 finale, but I think it was done in a slightly better way. To provide some context, Grogu has been stolen by the Empire, and Mando has constructed a mission to try and save him. He needs to find Moff Gideon's ship, and to do so, he takes Mayfeld out of prison because he's a former Imperial. Prior to this scene, there's a long chase sequence where we actually learn a decent amount about Mayfeld and what goes on inside his head. In his first appearance in Chapter 6, we didn't really learn much about him. He was kinda just there to serve as an antagonist to Mando, but here during this sequence on the truck or whatever, he says something very important. As far as I'm concerned, if you can make it through your day and still sleep at night, you're doing better than most. What this tells us about Mayfeld in a subtle way is that there is something preventing him from, as he says, still sleeping at night. When we get to the actual scene inside the Imperial base, we learn pretty much everything about Mayfeld, and a lot about Mando too. But first, let's talk about Mayfeld. What keeps him up at night is his time with the Empire. When we learned that he was a former Imperial in Chapter 6, we didn't think much of it. We just assumed that he just got lucky and survived the war and doesn't think much about it. We associate evil with the Empire unless we are specifically shown otherwise. But what the audience never considered was that Mayfeld has some deep regrets about his time with the Empire. He talks about Operation Cinder, which was an event where the Empire attempted to destroy some of its own worlds. I'm not going to talk about why this all happened, but if you're curious, look it up after this video. Just look up Operation Cinder. Now, to the casual viewer, this doesn't really mean much, but to someone like me who's played the Battlefront campaign and read a lot of the books, having Operation Cinder tie into this major character revealing moment was such a treat for me. Mayfeld has some deep hatred towards the Empire because a lot of his former comrades died during Operation Cinder, and living with the fact that he worked for an empire that would do something like this has kept him up at night. It's haunted him. Mayfeld is confronting his demons here, who in this case is his former Imperial officer. After he listens to his former officer justify Operation Cinder, he cracks and kills him in what was frankly a really risky move. What makes this so brilliant is that it ties into something that very few people recognize. You may see someone who's confident as hell like Mayfeld or has it all figured out, but you never know what demons they may be struggling with. I want you guys to think about a friend you have or a person you know that seems to have all the money in the world or seems to have everything figured out. I guarantee you that person is struggling with something that keeps them up at night. That's just simple human nature, and I love that Star Wars and specifically this show has tapped into that. Even as they are escaping, Mayfeld hands Mando his helmet back and refuses to look at his face. It's a small gesture that means the world to Mando. Mayfeld has already seen Mando's face, but by not getting one one last look, if you will, at Mando's face shows us that deep down he's a good person. He respects Mando and his code even though he's been teasing him. Behind that exterior that constantly teased Mando, he's a good guy. Mando recognizes this, and at the end of the episode, he lets Mayfeld go free. It's a perfect conclusion to Mayfeld's character. Granted, I hope we see him again, but if not, it's still a perfect conclusion. But let's talk about Mando now. It has been a strong point of emphasis throughout the entire series how important it is that Mando keeps his helmet on. If he removes his helmet and anyone sees his face, he is no longer a Mandalorian according to his code. When they enter the base, Mando needs his face scanned so he can access Imperial files. Granted, I'll say that this seems a bit contrived. Of course, the only way for Mando to access something is by having to show his face. But as the saying goes, coincidences that help your character is bad storytelling, but coincidences that hurt your character can be good storytelling. Mando removes his helmet and lets an Imperial officer see his face. Mando has broken his code, all for just a chance at seeing Grogu. I think this is the reason why I prefer this scene to Mando's final goodbye. In that scene, he was showing Grogu his face, which is still powerful no doubt, but he knew he was going to have a touching moment with Grogu. He threw his code away for something guaranteed. Here in chapter 15, there was no guarantee he would ever see Grogu again. He broke his most sacred rule just at the chance of seeing Grogu again. And to me, that speaks volumes about Mando and his character. Even in the book of Boba Fett, we see the consequences of this, but I 100% guarantee you that Mando does not regret his decision. All these reasons are why Mayfeld and Mando entering the Imperial base in chapter 15 is the best scene in The Mandalorian season 2, and frankly the best scene in The Mandalorian as a whole. What is the best scene in the book of Boba Fett? For this video, I tried to be somewhat fair to the Boba Fett character by choosing a scene from his actual episodes and not The Mandalorian season 2.5. So with that being said, the best scene in the book of Boba Fett is Boba Fett's initiation into the Tusken Raider clan at the end of chapter 2. Even though I feel there was a lot to be desired in terms of Boba Fett's character, I felt that the world building in this series was phenomenal. I'm always a big fan of when Star Wars adds more nuance to things. In my previous best scenes video on The Mandalorian season 2, I talked about how we assumed Mayfeld was some douche because he worked for the Empire. But then as we got to learn more about him, we learned that he had some deep regrets about his time with the Empire and wanted to make things right. Throughout Star Wars, Tusken Raiders have always been portrayed as nothing more than savages. They ransacked Luke and his speeder in A New Hope, and they brutally abused Anakin's mother to the point where she died. Even when Anakin tells Padme about how he killed an entire village of Tuskens, Padme doesn't seem to think it's that big of a deal, because to her, Tusken Raiders aren't really people. Klieg Lars described them as monsters too. All the indications of Tusken Raiders that we've gotten so far in Star Wars were that these people aren't really people, but animalistic savages. Now, The Mandalorian did dive deeper into the Tusken culture, showing us that they are more civilized than we previously thought, but the first few episodes of the Book of Boba Fett took that to a completely different level. We see some of their rituals, how they communicate, what they value, and most importantly, we learn that they aren't simply savages. This is a culture, one that is fairly different from human beings, but it's a culture nonetheless. The way they take in Boba Fett and attempt to make him one of their own shows us that they aren't just savages, that they are just misunderstood by humans. Pretty much the entire flashback sequences of the first two episodes do a good job at humanizing the Tusken Raiders, but for me, it's the final few scenes in chapter 2 that really succeed at it. First, we got the scene where Boba intakes the lizard up his nose and has his massive trip where he goes and finds his tree branch, and that was really interesting. Yeah, it was weird, but it showed us a Tusken Raider custom, which is awesome world building. Then we see him build his gaffy stick, which was pretty cool. I loved the fight scene of his in The Mandalorian chapter 14, so seeing the origins of that was pretty awesome. And then the dance at the end was neat. Recently, with Disney Star Wars projects, especially in live action, world building hasn't really been its strong suit, but seeing these Tuskens dance in their own type of initiation ritual for Boba Fett was so fascinating. It's really simple for me. This series did an incredible job at expanding the Tusken Raider culture, and that's what I want these Star Wars shows to do. Expand on the Star Wars mythos and lore in a way that the movies movies can't. I love the world building in the Book of Boba Fett, and that's why the final scene of Chapter 2 is the best scene of the Book of Boba Fett. What is the best scene in Obi-Wan Kenobi? Unlike most people, I don't find this show to be the worst thing in existence. I think it has a lot of highs and also a lot of lows. But the highest high for me is the conversation between Obi-Wan and Vader right after their final duel. You could say the entire duel because I think the duel was well done, but I wanted to specifically highlight the brief exchange the two have after the fight. Where the series as a whole worked for me was with Obi-Wan's arc. The trope of a broken man redeeming themselves is a bit of a tired trope, but if there's anyone who does deserve this trope, it's Obi-Wan. After losing everything in Revenge of the Sith, I would expect nothing else but for Obi-Wan to be this broken man, and we clearly see that in the first episode. All throughout the series, Obi-Wan learns to fight for something again, and he goes on this arc of becoming the Obi-Wan we know in A New Hope. But what weighed on his conscience more than anything was what happened to Anakin. In many ways, Obi-Wan blamed himself for what happened. Thinking Anakin was long dead, he never had the real opportunity to get the closure he deserved. Come this series, Obi-Wan learns Anakin is alive. He briefly accepts that this Darth Vader is not Anakin, but that all changes once he sees the crack in the mask. Now, of course, a lot of people are going to compare this to Star Wars Rebels, as they should. From a purely visual level, these moments play out almost identically. But there's a key difference between Ahsoka's story and Obi-Wan's story. Ahsoka only found out that Anakin was not only alive, but also Darth Vader a few days prior. Anakin's fall to the dark side hasn't been on her mind for the past 15 years. Ahsoka was able to live her life and make a difference by joining the rebellion. Ahsoka is definitely moved by fighting Vader, and she apologizes for leaving Anakin in Season 5 of the Clone Wars, but this moment here wasn't an emotional catharsis for Ahsoka up until that point. Her life hasn't been on pause because of the birth of Darth Vader. You could argue all that changed with Ahsoka after the fight, as we clearly see in the Ahsoka series, but Ahsoka's demons arise after her fight with Vader, while with Obi-Wan, they were there long before their fight in the show. So not only is Obi-Wan aware that his former brother turned to the dark side before this fight, but he blames himself. Obi-Wan holds immense guilt from the events of Revenge of the Sith, so confronting Vader here is something he has to do. When he sees half of the face of his apprentice, one last time he tries to have a conversation with Anakin. He breaks down into tears and apologizes for everything. Even though Anakin doesn't really accept the apology, I think people don't understand the therapeutic importance that a simple apology can have. There are countless stories of people with immense guilt, and the only way they can move on is by confronting those they hurt and apologizing. For the better part of a decade, Obi-Wan felt this immense guilt for failing Anakin, and he was never able to apologize. But now he realizes Anakin is alive, and he has the chance to do so. He apologizes and is now finally ready to move on with the rest of his life. One could argue that this is the thematic and emotional climax of the entire show. Obi-Wan in a way has overcame his guilt and is ready to move on. I love this scene because this brief exchange is what I always thought the ending of Revenge of the Sith should have been like. I find this moment to be far more powerful than the "You were the chosen one" speech. It felt more real and genuine, and that is why it is the best scene in the entire series. What is the best scene in Andor? God, there are so many great scenes to choose from. The escape from Aldhani could be the best scene, the one-way out scene could be the best in the season, the fight the Empire scene in the final episode could be the best in the season, but if I had to choose one scene from Andor that is the single best scene, it would have to be Luthen's speech. This scene here perfectly continues on the themes that were conveyed in Rogue One. That movie to many is all about sacrifice, and that is certainly the most prominent theme, but what I love about Rogue One is that it's far more than just sacrifice. What the Rogue One team and the rest of the Rebels did in that movie was not only sacrifice themselves, but they sacrificed themselves for something that was not guaranteed. Rogue One isn't about people giving their lives to destroy the Death Star. It's about people who gave their lives so others could have a chance at destroying the Death Star. Jyn and Cassian will never know if their sacrifices were worth it, but they gladly died anyway. In Andor, we don't particularly get that type of sacrifice from Luthen, at least not yet, but this speech that he gives basically tells us that he is ready to make that sacrifice. Of all the memorable quotes during this monologue, the one that has always stuck with me the most is, "I burn my life to make a sunrise I know I'll never see." That one line tells me everything I need to know about Luthen. That line basically means that he's willing to give his life for a cause he won't be alive to celebrate. He knows he won't be there if the Empire were to ever fall. He knows he won't be there to celebrate with the Rebels. What this series does for me is completely change how I view the ending of Return Return of the Jedi. When they celebrate on Endor, I now think about all the people who died and aren't there to celebrate with Luke. Luthen, like Cassian and Jyn, is one of those people, and this scene alone reminds me of that. Of course, I need to highlight how well written this scene was, not just that one line about a sunrise, but the whole damn thing. This show, and especially this monologue, just makes me want to rebel against something, and I don't think I can give a bigger compliment to the writers. So even though it was a close one, Luthen's speech I found to be the best scene in Andor. Oh boy, The Mandalorian Season 3. You guys might know that I hate this season. I think it has almost no redeeming qualities. Just prior to writing this, I actually went on a 20 to 30 minute walk to clear my mind and think about what I found to be the best scene in the season. And boy, did I struggle. But I came to the conclusion that the best scene in The Mandalorian Season 3 is the Mandalorians celebrating their victory on their newly retaken Mandalore. The finale didn't pay off much well, but I do feel it paid off the whole plight of the Mandalorians fairly well. All the way back in Season 1, we had seen how much the Mandalorians had struggled. They were forced to remain in hiding in the trenches of a backwater planet. Then a handful of them were killed just so Gideon could get back to Mando. We come across more clans of Mandalorians that were mocked and ridiculed just as much as Mando's clan. In Season 3, we see them come together briefly, but it culminated in all these clans putting aside their differences to fight for Mandalore. Yeah, I wish the final battle was better, but there was something so satisfying about seeing the Mandalorians stand together for once. Bo-Katan and the armor together symbolized the two clans coming together. It was a brief moment, but one I found to be satisfying. Now, another reason I like this ending is because of what it can set up in the future. The whole plotline of the Mandalorians retaking Mandalore is now over, so whenever we do get a Mandalorian Season 4, the writers can focus on something completely new. It can be the fight against Thrawn, it can be hunting other Imperials. The future has endless possibilities. I also assume that we will see all these Mandalorians come together again in the future, whether that be the Dave Filoni movie or something else. Now that I'm writing this out, maybe I think this is the best scene because it wrapped up a season I frankly quite hate, but either way, this was the best scene in The Mandalorian Season 3. What is the best scene in Ahsoka? Unlike The Mandalorian Season 3, this was not a hard question for me. The best scene in the show was the Ahsoka vs. Baylan fight and Sabine giving Baylan the map. As a whole, I thought Episode 4 was the best episode of the season, and the biggest reason why was how it handled tension. I thought the tension surrounding whether Baylan and Morgan would escape was perfectly done. That all came to a head during Ahsoka's fight. One aspect of this fight that I appreciated far more than most of the fights was the visuals. I wouldn't say the series was filmed spectacularly or anything, and I wouldn't even say this fight was perfectly filmed, but the color scheme of Cetos with the bright blue lights of the map along with the orange and white lightsabers made the scene visually pleasing. Oftentimes, a location can really help out a scene visually, and Cetos did that. Another thing about this fight that I liked is the personal dynamic behind it. You guys know I like the fights where there are actual personal stakes. Sure, at this point, Baylan and Ahsoka had never met, but the two are certainly aware of each other. I love how all fight Baylan is taunting Ahsoka with Anakin and his ultimate fate. It was a great thing to include in this episode that tied in nicely into the next episode. One major criticism this series faced was the choreography of the lightsaber fights. And call me basic, but I just didn't have an issue with any of the fights. I thought this fight was well done and well choreographed. The fight ends with Baylan defeating Ahsoka and convincing Sabine to give him the map. This part was so well done. This moment truly highlights what kind of character Baylan was. He's not this criminally evil person. He just has a goal and he knows how to manipulate others into getting what he wants. Also, all throughout Star Wars, we've seen Darksiders stick out their hand to recruit someone else, and for maybe the first time, the person's spiel actually worked. I also love this moment for Sabine because it was a moment where a character made a fundamentally human decision. Will Sabine risk the fate of the galaxy to save her best friend? She will. True character is revealed when a person makes decisions under pressure, and Sabine surely did that. Now, I may not absolutely love how Sabine faced the consequences for her decision later on. Ezra never finds out Sabine risked the galaxy for him, and Ahsoka appears to forgive her rather easily. But regardless of what the outcome was, I do love the setup. Ahsoka was a series that was flawed in many ways, for sure, but I gotta give Episode 4, and more specifically this scene, a lot of credit. I thought it was well directed, well written, well acted, and set up the rest of the season nicely. I wouldn't say this was easily the best scene in the show, but it was my #1 choice for the best scene in Ahsoka. The best scene in The Acolyte was surprisingly easy for me to choose. Since I really disliked the show, the best scene has to go to one of the few scenes I enjoyed, and that's the lightsaber fight in the 5th episode. I know this fight technically takes place over the course of multiple scenes, but I'm just gonna combine it into one scene and say it was the best one. Episode 5 is the best episode of the series, and the only reason why is because of this lightsaber fight. I know prequel fans out there will be pissed when I say this fight was really good, because how dare something be as good or better than the fights in the prequels, but yeah, I would say I enjoyed the action here a lot more than I did in the prequels, sue me. Someone might go frame by frame and point out openings where someone easily could have been killed. Yeah, as if Anakin and Obi-Wan twirling their lightsabers for 2 seconds is a peak example of realistic sword combat. In this episode, we got hand-to-hand combat, force combat, lightsaber combat. The only part of the fight that stunk was when those bugs took Chimera away. The parts where Jackie was fighting Chimera was genuinely impressive. I don't get impressed by action often in film or TV these days, but I gotta give this episode credit, I was impressed. I loved the added element of the cortosis armor. Seeing Chimera head smash other people's lightsabers was awesome and unique. Some people these days are fed up with the lightsabers in a dark forest kind of fight. Well, not me. Fights where there's a dark scenery contrasted with the bright lightsabers are always fights I enjoy. Overall, the action was filmed well. A few shots weren't great, but most of them worked for me. What maybe impressed me more than the action in this episode was how willing the writers were to kill off a bunch of characters. At first, the fight began and all the no-name Jedi were dying first, and then there were these little bullshit moments where Yord gets away with just a scratch and the stranger ran away from Padawan Jackie. I was like, of course they're only gonna kill the no-name Jedi. This is Star Wars, they don't have the balls to kill named characters. But then Jackie proceeded to get stabbed in the chest 3 times and Yord got his neck snapped. Kudos to you, Leslie Headland. For the first time in a while, Star Wars really surprised me in a good way. Too bad the rest of the show sucked. Chimera was another highlight in this fight. He was probably the only character in the show I liked. He was a different kind of Sith, and I didn't mind that. Overall, this fight and some of the drama surrounding it was a pleasure to watch. It's also possible I only enjoyed this fight so much because the rest of the show was so bad. What is the best scene in Skeleton Crew? This is a tough one because at the time of making this video, this season hasn't finished yet, but so far at least, my favorite scene in the show was kinda just Wim's introduction in the 1st episode. Skeleton Crew has tapped into something special with Star Wars, something I haven't seen Star Wars tap into before. Many have criticized Disney for relying too much on nostalgia over the years, and I totally agree with this. The Force Awakens was a huge nostalgia fest, and it turns out the best parts of that movie were the things that were original to the sequels. Outside of that, so much of Star Wars has continued to rely on nostalgia, but it does it in a way where it's like, oh, do you remember this? Do you remember this character? Do you remember this planet? Do you remember this battle? That type of nostalgia ages terribly, because the novelty of seeing something familiar again can only have that impact on you once, maybe a few other times. What Skeleton Crew does is rely on nostalgia, but in a different way. Instead of telling us, oh, do you remember this and do you remember that? Skeleton Crew taps into our relationship with Star Wars. It wants us to feel nostalgic over how we feel about the franchise. Do you remember being a kid and just constantly thinking about Star Wars? Do you remember hanging out with your friends and pretending to be Jedi using lightsabers? That's the type of nostalgia this show taps into. I don't care how many times I watch Skeleton Crew, watching these kids have fun and pretend to be Jedi is something I'm always going to be nostalgic over. This type of nostalgia doesn't age like the other things we've been seeing. A lot can change with Skeleton Crew, but so far the best scene in the show is the day in the life scenes with Wim. Now that I have covered all the best scenes in all the live action movies and shows, what do I feel is the best scene in all of Star Wars? That award will have to go to Vader's death and redemption in Return of the Jedi. Star Wars has a lot of themes, but the ones that matter the most to me are the themes of family and redemption. And what better scene is there to exemplify that than Vader giving his life to save his son? It is a perfect scene and will most likely forever be my favorite scene in Star Wars. What do you guys think about all my choices? Do you have scenes in particular movies or shows that you think are better? Let me know down below. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to unite the Claude Squad, and I will see you guys next time.